you said that there's somehow a culture in police departments to fear black men. That's not accurate.
No,
that's a different argument.
What I said is how this feels to us. I'm not saying that as fact. I don't know how you're trained and how your culture.
And I think
this
we should also broaden it to say, not necessarily that people are trained, but that society kind of acculturates us to fear. And that's not necessarily just as specific to police officers, but I think that is all of us. And so that is how the whole justice system becomes corrupted and biased, because we make up the justice system. We are the jurors. We are the people who pass judgment. We are the judges. We are the police officers. All of the bias that exists within society comes out, and we are not always even aware that we have the bias. That is the sad part about it. That is the truth.
Dan, you don't believe that?
No, I think that's just an easy excuse. And for you to say that and say that and just make a massive stereotype that somehow there's this latent bias and everybody instinctively, because you said that there's somehow a culture in police departments to fear black men. That's not accurate.
No,
that's a different argument.
What I said is how this feels to us. I'm not saying that as fact. I don't know how you're trained and how your culture.
And I think we should
feels.
also broaden it to say, not necessarily that people are trained, but that society kind of acculturates us to fear. And that's not necessarily just as specific to police officers, but I think that is all of us. And so that is how the whole justice system becomes corrupted and biased, because we make up the justice system. We are the jurors. We are the people who pass judgment. We are the judges. We are the police officers. All of the bias that exists within society comes out, and we are not always even aware that we have the bias. That is the sad part about it. That is the truth.
Dan, you don't believe that?
No, I think that's just an easy excuse. And for you to say that and say that and just make a massive stereotype that somehow there's this latent bias and everybody instinctively, because they've watched a movie once or twice, fears someone who happens to look different than them is utterly absurd.
Do you have any knowledge of the social science on implicit bias in America? Do you have any knowledge whatsoever? But there is a mountain of evidence that backs up the notion that there is implicit and explicit bias in American society. And for you to suggest that is not true is ridiculous. And it is offensive on a night like this for you to suggest that.
I think it's ridiculous that you're stereotyping and basically all of America and say that somehow that, and I'm not denying, again, for the second time, that the black experience in America is far different. I don't know what it's like to have a hoodie on in Manhattan and not be able to get a cab. I don't. I will never understand that. But for you to stereotype the entire country and quote a few footnotes in social science and say,
those are major studies, and don't try to talk out of both sides of your mouth and say that you recognize the bias and then that you deny the bias. You cannot have it both ways. There is bias in America. You cannot deny that. You cannot deny science. And this is not a night on which you're going to be able to deny science.
Right. Explain to me, please, the science that everyone in America has some.
No one says everyone. Whenever people start saying everyone and no one, there's always and there is never. They have already stepped outside the boundaries of social science. That is not the way science works. Science never says always, never, everyone, and no one. It says that there is a bias and it tilts one way or another. Really? And there is a mountain of social science that says that there are biases that tilt, and they tilt against everyone.
Dan, there are tons of studies.
But all other ways.
I mean, there are tons of studies that are done where people are shown photographs of other people and have to make split-second judgments of those people. And, I mean, there are many, many studies showing there is inherent bias in many people.
Right, but how does that relate to this specific case today? We can have a very sensible, reasonable argument about why he was confronted over selling Lucy cigarettes in the street, chokeholds and policing. But to make this big, bold statement that there's somehow a latent bias that may have contributed to this.
I hear you on this. Charles, how do you respond to that?
That is how data is collected. It is collected in the aggregate. If you just try to look at individual cases, you can always make an argument back and forth. What we have to do is to look at all the data, look at all of the cases, and look and see if there is bias in all of the cases. If you can show me the same numbers of people, not only in America, but also right here in New York City who are white, who have been shot by police officers, and you can show me that it is equitable, then I will listen to that argument. But you
Well,
cannot
are you
do that
willing to
because it
present
is
that-
absolutely
you-
not
you
true.
don't-
The New York Times has
you
up
don't
on its
wanna
site
listen to anyone.
tonight every notable case of police killing in New York City going all the way back to 1990, and it is full of black and brown faces. And you cannot look at that list and say, you can go one situation after another and say, well, I can figure out this person might have been, this officer might have been afraid, this officer might have tried to do something, this officer might have been justified. But when you look at that in the aggregate, you look at all of the data, you cannot come away from that suggesting that there is equity in the number of people who are shot and killed
Who's
by
saying
police
that?
officers. That is simply
So Dan,
not the case.
Dan, you can respond.
Charles, well, you don't appear to be open to any argument on me, so it really doesn't
I'm
matter.
not open to
That's
people
not-
being killed on the street.
Who said that? Are you just making this up as you go along?
No, nobody's
Who
making
said-
it up, but we're not going to
Hold
deny
on,
what I
hold on,
said.
hold on,
Let Dan respond.
Am I allowed to talk? Charles, no one is saying that more black men may not have been shot. I don't have that data. What I'm saying is, if we are interested in solving the problem generated from this case, which I agree from both perspectives, there are some very serious problems here with what happened. By you saying that there's a latent bias here and that there may have been some racism in this case without any evidence of it in this specific case does nothing to solve the problem
I'm
going
not saying,
forward.
I never even drilled down on this specific case. I said you have to
So
look
then
at it in the aggregate. You have to look at
How
all
does
of the
that
data,
help?
and you also have to look at society as a whole. If we can acknowledge that there is bias in society, we have to be able to acknowledge that that bias can creep into our justice system. That is what I have said, and I have said nothing more than that, and you will not put words in my mouth.
Charles, well, you've done that for me. I'm not saying, I just got done explaining to you, I am not saying there is not bias, and that would be ridiculous. There's not bias in society. Of course there's misogyny, racism, xenophobia. Of course we're a society of men and women, we're all sinners. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying you don't seem to have any interest in solving the problem this case generated going forward, other than making bold claims about some cultural problem in America that you can't pinpoint existed in this case. You can.
So why wasn't he just written a ticket, right? So there's some things that are just very simple that are causing trauma and pain in a way that is sometimes inexplicable. This is a very simple question.
Given what he was alleged to have done.
Right. If you're selling Lucy's, if you're selling, knockoff handbags, right? When you're selling petty little things on the street, typically you're given a citation. And so in this instance, we can't manage what happened. Particularly, you hear the fellow who was videotaping it, he had just broken up a fight. Eric Gardner had just stopped violence on the street in his community. Then you pick up where they're approaching him for Lucy's. So this idea of his humanity not being considered
Dan,
and not being given something simple like a ticket
Dan,
rather than being killed.
right. Dan, how important to you do you think it will be, if a judge allows it, to hear what the grand jury actually heard? Because the grand jury was seated for some 3 months. They heard an awful lot of witnesses. They heard an awful lot of testimony. We don't know what they heard. The prosecutor says you're going to appeal to a judge to try to release that information. To you, is that going to be critical in trying to determine what happened?
Absolutely, Anderson. In this